welcome to everyone. I am so excited about this conversation. When the Readiness Projects got started about 2 years ago, the partners put together a paper, which I think is going to get dropped in the chat, which has a longer title, but it's really focused on what's the connection between thriving, learning, and equity. And we're just going to dig into that conversation today. We all talk about equity and we see equity as a goal. Thriving really is what we're aiming for. And for young people to really be thriving, which is more than just doing well, it's really that sense of growth and development and opportunity that you're thriving, that you're really moving forward. And for young people to really be thriving, it's a constant balance between them building and using their competencies to make meaning out of and make adjustments in the context in which they find themselves. And when we're going to talk about equity, there really isn't any larger context that's in front of young people than racial identity. And so I am so delighted to be able to bring Dr. Joanna Williams on to join us, to give us a glimpse into this really short, as research papers go, short but powerful paper looking at this intersection between adolescent development and anti-racism and how we really boldly bring these two topics together. So we're going to hear about the paper and how it got put together and how this report really can help us move forward. And we're going to zoom into one of the quadrants that they talk about in the paper in terms of the spheres of influence where young people really go to find meaning and find support and relevance in really dealing with the times. And that is this idea of community. And as all of you know, community often is the most nebulous space that we talk about young people spending their time in. And that could be anything from people interpreting that as the random people who live in your neighborhood, to other community systems beyond schools, to community organizations, to a sense of community based on culture. Community can mean so many different things. We're really going to sort of dig into understanding what it is that we can do as people who are really trying to help young people make meaning in their communities, what our role is, because we really do have a critical role. And so with that sort of brief introduction, I don't want to take any more time away from Joanna. So Joanna, I just want to kick off by saying, a long time ago, I sort of deflected out of academia into this sort of action research advocacy space, just because I didn't have the patience and the temperament to follow all the research rules. And so I have to tell you how delighted I was when the Center for the Developing Adolescents and the National Science Council put this paper out, just focused so boldly on what the connection is between this growing knowledge that we have about adolescent development and the importance of really understanding adolescence development and how that really intersects with this conversation about anti-racism. So my first question is, how did you and your colleagues decide to be so bold? How did you make this focus? And how did you zoom in even more to not just talk about diversity, but really zoom in on Black adolescents and on anti-Black racism? Tell us how you got there.
I would love to do that. Let me say good morning to everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to get a chance to talk with Karen, who I deeply respect and admire, and also to bring this report onto folks' radar. I can remember actually some of our committee's early conversations about, we knew we were going to focus on issues of race and equity, but what that would look like. And we came to three important conclusions, and we actually named these in the report that guide our reasoning for focusing on Black adolescents. One is that anti-Black racism and race-based inequities, both historically and in terms of current day, have created unique shared experiences among Black adolescents, which means that although there's a great deal of diversity in, somebody who might use the label of Black who's an adolescent, when we start to look at, in aggregate, we can see impacts of racism. We can see shared experiences around needing to cope with racism and racial discrimination and other race-related stressors. So we know that from the science. That was one. The second reason is that, we've had lots of, I would say, moments over the past 10 years or so where race had really come into kind of our national level of consciousness and national dialogue. We started working on this report last year where, we were in another one of these moments where there's been some focused attention on systemic anti-Black racism and related injustices. They're on the forefront of our national awareness, spurred in part by the murder of Black Americans across the country, and that happening over and over again, as well as other activism, scholarship, and dialogue from people of color who are often leading these conversations. And last, so we are the National Scientific Council on Adolescence, and really our goal is to bring the science together and translate it to people who can use it. And the majority of adolescent research on racism focuses on Black youth. So when we think about our best science and what and who we know most about, focusing on Black youth really reflects the existing scholarship.
So talk a little bit more about, I think I did a little blog to summarize the report. It was so concise, and I'm sure that's dropped in the chat as well. But give us the sort of the top note recommendations that came out of the report before we zoom into that specific space of community. Where did you land as you're thinking about how these intersect?
Sure. So one of the things that I really like to highlight that is known, and we're bringing together existing science. We weren't going out and doing new research. And we know that the science supporting the existence and the negative impacts of interpersonal racism, structural racism, and anti-Blackness is irrefutably clear. We know that racism negatively impacts many aspects of healthy adolescent development, from self-esteem and mental health to academic outcomes, behaviors. It reduces access to resources, it normalizes and allows us to accept racist behavior, and it interferes with the supportive developmental needs within the spaces and places where Black adolescents spend their time. So in our report, we begin by talking about core developmental needs that all adolescents have. So including the need for identity, exploration, and belonging, and starting to find that sense of self, as well as the need for agency and exploration. And we talk about how in the context of racism and living in a racially stratified society, those developmental needs are changed and they're sort of disrupted by the existence and, kind of bumping up against racism in adolescents' daily lives. So if you are making meaning of yourself in a context where you are exposed to messages that don't affirm who you are, that's a challenge that many Black adolescents are dealing with. And for Black youth, when we think about exploration and agency, all adolescents need opportunities to try new things, to make mistakes, and have opportunities to fail and then to try again. If the consequences of those mistakes are disproportionate for Black adolescents, disproportionately negative, then we're also, seeing young people being pushed out of the systems where they should be receiving support, like schools, and pushed into systems where their developmental needs are, generally not met, like the justice system, for example. And those are disproportionate realities for Black youth. And then what we do in the rest of the report, and I know we'll focus a bit on communities, is talk about in the places and spaces where Black youth and all adolescents spend a great deal of time with peers and on social media, in families, in schools and communities, what does it look like to, at the intersection of these developing needs and the context of racism and how it sort of shows up differently in those spaces?
One quick question before we keep moving forward. Your comments about the importance of thinking about how this intersects with the important role of just building your own identity, individual and collective identity, and how it really sort of fits into building a sense of agency when agency requires failure and the consequences can be very disproportionate. Talk a little bit also, if you can, about the other thing that young people are doing in adolescence is really rounding out and building this set of competencies. And often in some of the research, you find that when you're looking at Black adolescents, their expression of competence often is met differently. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. This is something that I am, sort of a strong supporter of what we call positive youth development. And when I was initially introduced to the 5 C's model, competence, confidence, connection, caring, and so on, that was one of my immediate observations, that when we see confidence in Black youth, oftentimes that gets read as aggression. And so when we think about experiences, say in school settings, and disproportionality around discipline as one example. The kinds of behaviors that come from Black bodies often get misinterpreted. So we say, on the one hand, competence and confidence are these important core needs and strengths of adolescence. But if we're not prepared to really support and value what that looks like when it's coming from a Black body, then it results in the disproportionalities that we see. So in the context of school discipline, we know that a lot of infractions are based on things that are really subjective. So infractions like, defiance or disrespect. And I think that's where we're, seeing a lot of the challenges. If I'm showing you that I'm confident by asking a really critical, important question, and you're my educator and you read that as disrespect, well, you're in the position of power to give me the consequences. And then I'm getting the message that, you don't want me here. And that you might even be afraid of me. So I think that that's a really important place where those intersections need to be eliminated.
Thanks. I think it's so important to just bring that research and that specificity into this conversation. So let's get to this idea of community. So you defined your 4 spaces and put them into sort of 4 quadrants: the peers, schools, families, and community. At the Readiness Projects, we also have 4 quadrants that we talk about, but we zoom out to sort of look at these broader systems. We still have school in that sort of top left quadrant. Then next to it, we still have this amorphous thing of communities, sort of zooming in on who are those community organizations or community partners that we could be playing with, we could be working with. Down below, we have sort of those basic services systems: health, housing, welfare, the systems that families hopefully don't have to use, but often do use. And often using those public systems has an impact on young people's identity and agency as well. And then the other quadrant is, which you've mentioned, sort of child welfare, criminal justice, juvenile justice. So you've got these places where young people in some ways have to show up. They have to show up in school. They're often required to show up or brought into child welfare and juvenile justice systems in our legal system. But they are often living in spaces in which the impact of having to have public supports for basic things like housing and healthcare has an impact. So all of that, when we think about it, is the broader context in which these community organizations that are trying to help young people make meaning exist. And often young people are bringing that whole self into community. So talk a little bit about, as you thought about community and the role that community organizations can play in helping young people generally move through their adolescent developmental needs, but also really understand and make meaning out of this sort of anti-Black sentiment. What's the role that you think these community organizations can play that's unique to them?
Yeah, so that's an important question. And in our brief report, we take a place-based approach to community. So we really are talking about kind of neighborhoods where adolescents live and the out of school and out of home spaces where they may spend their time. Communities can offer places and spaces for belonging and opportunities for safe exploration. Community involvement is a space in which adolescents can develop a sense of purpose. We know from research on adolescent development that purpose is another core developmental need. Having a sense of purpose can buffer against stress, it can support resilience, and community organizations oftentimes become a space where you don't necessarily have the same restrictions and formal organization like you do in school settings. And oftentimes they're better able to kind of meet these needs that youth have around developing sense of purpose and actually, exercising agency and exploration and all of those things. Communities are also places in which adolescents can get involved in anti-racism activities and other types of activism and advocacy. And oftentimes community-based organizations become sort of the place that scaffolds that kind of activity for young people. So when, active engagement, civic engagement opportunities are explicitly focused on local youth-centered issues that are personally relevant to the adolescents who are involved, that can result in positive outcomes, not just for adolescents themselves, but also for the community. So when adolescents are supported in, opportunities to lead and make change and explore and ask critical questions, we all have the potential to benefit. So we talk in our report in each of these contexts about recommendations. And I just want to say a note about how we frame our recommendations. We tried to be very intentional about connecting the science with actionable recommendations, as opposed to sometimes you get like a 30,000 foot thing that is harder, frankly, to act on. So in our community focused recommendations, we speak to funders who we encourage to increase resources for community organizations who are already committed to supporting youth activism and other activities that create space for Black adolescents to cultivate purpose and, make contributions to their communities. So, that's more resources. Community-based organizations themselves, we emphasize building staff capacity to help reduce turnover and increase sustainable adult-youth relationships, which again meet a core developmental need for adolescents. And I know community-based organizations often work really hard to do that. But ensuring that youth have a sense of stability with, when they show up in a place that the adults that, they've gotten to know will be there for a length of time is important. We encourage stronger partnerships between community-based organizations and universities for things like ongoing training, training of staff in evidence-based practices that are designed to meet the needs of Black adolescents in particular. And we encourage youth, frankly, to continue their engagement in community-based programs, to share these opportunities with their peers, to take advantage of social media platforms to communicate messages, and involve others in the work of community change as well.
Wonderful. Well, with that, we're going to segue into bringing in some of these community partners to hear what it takes to really sort of put those recommendations into action, what their opportunities are and what their barriers are. But I want to ask you one more question as we're sort of bringing folks in, and that is, did you in any way sort of road test these ideas with adolescents themselves?
Yes, and that was a pleasure. We had 4 adolescents who ranged from 9th grade to just the beginning of college, who had an opportunity to weigh in on early drafts. We asked them for feedback on the recommendations, and it was really it made a huge concrete difference in the report. So I remember an early conversation where we were talking about, these are some of the contexts we're going to highlight. And they were like, wait, you didn't mention social media. Like, why are you leaving that out? And there were other ways in which they really were very thoughtful and specific and concrete about, this is actually what we see playing out, and we need to make sure to be careful about, how we frame these things in the report. So we're grateful to them as our reviewers and our contributors to the report. And some of them have continued as we disseminate to bring their voices to the table as well.
Wonderful. So let's get Asia and Jamila in and on the screen. And I will change my views to make sure that they're there, and really sort of get this conversation started and even more grounded. One of the challenges, and I think we want to be blunt here, one of the challenges that a lot of national organizations have is how you bring this into your organization when you have affiliates or partners in everything from Detroit to rural Wyoming. How do you?
I'll be back, Ms. Linda.
We need people to mute themselves. There you go. So it really is a challenge for national organizations to figure out how to do this, how to support it, how to be bold about it. I think the boldness here is just as important as the boldness on the research side. So Jamila, let's just start with you. As a 4-H civic engagement specialist, first of all, let's make sure that everybody knows what 4-H is, and the fact that 4-H has for a long time now, not just been rural, but been working in urban areas, working with Black adolescents and adolescents of color. So tell us a little bit about 4-H and then zoom in on the specific work you've been doing.
Thank you, Karen. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for having us to be able to speak about 4-H. So I'll just talk about where we deliver programs, right? So 4-H Youth Development is the youth development program of the cooperative extension system. So whether it's master gardening, composting, our regular standard programs where young people are working in ag or working in sustainable foods or working in food and nutrition, right? Any program that touches the opportunity to work with young people in community is a part of our 4-H Youth Development Program. And so we deliver those programs in after school, in schools, in clubs, in camps, and in virtual spaces. But I think sometimes people aren't aware that we also deliver them primarily not just in rural spaces, and that has been the tradition of 4-H, But the true tradition of 4-H has been in urban spaces. And so we have, a longstanding tradition of having Black clubs that have, grown peanuts and studied and researched peanuts under Carver. And at our HBCUs. And so in New York State, we're rewriting, right, some of those experiences. And part of that rewriting comes in the way that we deliver our programs, and one program in particular. And so we run a program, we get funding through NIFA USDA. Our Sifer programs have been funded thanks to June Mead, who is here today, for the last 25 plus years of funding that we've received. And its goal really is to look at creating quality and quantity, comprehensive community-based programs for at-risk children, which, right, let's be clear, that's all of our kids. But more specifically, right, when we look at that, who's underrepresented within our programs, right? And so we're working with underrepresented youth. And, Sifer's mission is really to shepherd those resources from the land-grant institution, in our case, it's Cornell, and the cooperative extension system to really help deliver educational programs that equip families that may have limited resources with opportunities. And it does more than meet basic needs, right? So we provide opportunities to belong. We provide those really supportive relationships, appropriate structures, opportunities for skill building. In the prior conversation, you were talking about creating those opportunities to safely try something and to create that level of risk. We do that in our programs, right? We create opportunities for them to learn about technology, physical and psychological safety, positive social norms, and mattering, right? That they matter. And create opportunities for them to build community. And then invariably, we create opportunities for sustainable communities, right? So we run sustainable community projects so that when we leave after that 5 years of funding, a community has built an awesome level of capacity. And so I'm grateful that my colleague Asia Ambler is here because she can speak to that as she served as one of our program participants and is now a colleague of mine working within our cooperative extension system.
Well, I absolutely want to welcome Asia and emphasize that last thing you just said, that very often one of the things that really helps in this connection of community is that you bring young people from participant into training, into program staff. But before we hear from Asia, Jamila, tell us what Sifer stands for. There's so many acronyms in everybody's bio. What does Sifer stand for?
Yeah, so Sifer stands for Children, Youth, and Families at Risk. And so again, it's a funding stream that comes through NIFA, National Institute for Food and Agriculture, through our USDA, so United States Department of Agriculture. And Sifer, the way that we internalize this in New York State is that the acronym means to us is Children, Youth, and Families as Resources, right? In community, children, youth, and families are the heart of that work. And we can't do anything without families. We can't do anything without building up capacity within families. And so we utilize young people as resources, help to develop and put them on that thriving trajectory, which looks a little different than the normal thriving trajectory, and which is individualized, right? Every young person has an idea of what it looks like to thrive. And so we very specifically look for that spark within that young person and help to really develop it.
Well, Asia, let's get you into this conversation. I saw you nodding vigorously as Joanna was talking about the research and the recommendations. How much does what you've heard square with what you experienced in Sifer? And I love that translation from at risk to resources. It's wonderful. So, Asia, how much did it square with what you've been experiencing?
So, as Jamila shared, I started as a participant when I was 14. And so 15 years later, all of the intentionality that I saw my 4-H educators do, it really comes home. And working in with Cornell Cooperative Extension, being a part of the behind the scenes stuff, the stuff that the young people don't see, it really makes sense how we got here. And so hearing her talk about intentionality and thriving and learning and equity, I see through the programming that I went through. So my educators were not people of color, were not women of color. And that was the norm in my community. That was what I was used to. And so, but I wasn't used to a community organization that was intentional, that really supported youth voice, which helps with that thriving model and building capacity and creating safe spaces to try stuff and to fail, but also to build up our ability to advocate for ourselves. And so the research, I'm now seeing it all come home, and that it really laid a solid foundation, not only to do the work, but then to go forward and create work of my own and take away that fear. And so something Dr. Williams mentioned, and I think I probably was nodding my head and moving my hair at the same time. She talked about, sorry, I took my notes because I'm all over the place and I was super excited, that affirming the identity. So all young people are in a stage of trying to figure out who they are, just basic developmental things, and the effects of racism on top of that, or being in a society where your identity, your beliefs, your home life, your culture is not affirmed. I didn't realize the impact until I got older. And now as an instructor, which I know is one of the next questions, so I won't go too deep into that, but I realized that having educators who were intentional and took time to create spaces for that allowed me to grow and develop a sense of self that can help with advocacy and also can help with whatever I wanted to do.
Well, I want to get to the place where you're now having transitioned into instructor. But before that, you mentioned just immediately the contrast between your instructors in the Sifer program and your instructors in school, just in terms of racial identity. And I wonder, is it just that you had this contrast, or was the program actually a place where you really got to analyze and make meaning of the impact of having these different kinds of settings? So we can have I had it over here and I didn't have it over here, but was this also a place where you really got to reflect and you got to sort of build up those skills and competencies to go back in and be more resilient in other settings? Was there intentionality in that way as well?
Absolutely. So we, the model for our Sifer programming is youth voice, and it's project based. And so we got to come in as young people, and I'll never forget because it's a super funny story. I don't know if anybody remembers disposable cameras, but we got these disposable cameras for our first project, and we were told to go out and take pictures of things we really loved about our community. And so in my mind, as a young Black woman who shows up in spaces as a Black person anywhere I go, my 4-H educators, who were white women, are giving me this camera, and I'm like, you want me to take pictures of my community? And I assumed at the time as a teenager, my community was everyone else's community to a certain extent. Or I assumed that my community was completely different. So we got these cameras and we went out and took pictures, and we had to bring them back and get them developed to show what we liked about our community and where we wanted, things we wanted to change. And so to have educators want to see things through our eyes, pre-smartphones, where you really had to be intentional. And then they took these pictures and kept them, and they incorporated it in our work. And then from those pictures, the young people as a group, we decided what we wanted to do about what we saw in our community. And so it wasn't just, hey, we got some young people, let's have them clean up a park, right? As much as beautification is wonderful and important, there was a sense of ownership in the projects that we did. So it wasn't tokenism, and it wasn't what we, nothing for us without us. And that was an idea that they didn't use those words, but it was shown in our programming. It was shown in how we delivered our projects. I remember one project they put on was a basketball tournament. So we had this particular group was all boys. We had 2 different groups. We were Tuesday and Thursday, and one group was all boys. And they said, there's no real basketball tournaments or things we can just go play, but it's not organized. And so these young teenage boys who were predominantly all Black went and created this basketball tournament that over 3 years grew so big that our executive director was a little nervous. We would need insurance, and you had all different members of the community coming out. And that was something that, my Cornell Cooperative Extension is as a predominantly white institution. And so not that white people don't play basketball, but for young Black boys in our area, it's a huge part of, what we do, what they do to just de-stress or have fun, or a way to build community. And so they created this tournament, and they, as young people, were the face of it. So they were known oh, you organized the basketball tournament. I can't wait to play next summer. And it was a 3-on-3 basketball tournament. They created shirts, they designed them. They had to go talk to stakeholders. They had to talk to people in the community to get sponsors, to get trophies. And that's just one real example of that intentionality of like, this is your project and we're just here to offer resources and support, or opportunities and supports, I'm sorry.
That's a wonderful example. And I think I really appreciate the fact that you brought home that adults, Black and white, when they're intentional, can create the settings in which you feel comfortable to bring your whole self and be safe and supported and have these conversations and sort of show what it means to be an adolescent in your community. And that's something, that a message that we have to hear. So now let's fast forward quickly to your instructor, and you're focused specifically on Black adolescents. What does that mean? What are you doing differently, build with all of your experiences, to really make sure that you're creating these kind of spaces for Black adolescents?
So referencing back to what Dr. Williams said, she said something about how competence shows up in Black youth. And so for me, it's in those spaces. As you can see, I can talk all day. And I have a really big personality, and I come from a family of big personalities. And it's never been viewed as a bad thing in my family, but I have watched other people shut it down in Black youth. So I make sure that in those spaces, how a Black youth shows up and presents is acceptable. And I don't want to say is acceptable as if I'm the judge and jury, but those affirmations, so nodding my head and smiling and giving those moments of connecting with a young person and not feeling like I have to go back as an adult and explain what they said, but letting what they say stand and letting what they say be enough. And allowing, and as a Black educator, making myself super available. So not to the point of being burnt out, but you have a means of contact. I share different parts of my story. I make sure I stand in the gap and in those spaces with my white coworkers and peers and people in the community, using the Cornell name only when appropriate to advocate, but never to kind of hold it over our young people's heads, but to advocate for them in other spaces. And really talking, like I said, sharing my experiences, talking about that, letting them show up how they are, being honest with them about my own experiences and what they may experience, and preparing them before they go into a space, acknowledging their Blackness, one, in front of their white peers or peers that are not Black or may be a different person of color, acknowledging their identities and reaffirming those.
Have you found any barriers to taking on this approach? And have you or your young people experienced any pushback as you bring this kind of sort of whole self activism into communities?
Oh, absolutely. And they've been moments of growth for myself, and it's caused me to kind of reflect. So definitely that showing up unapologetically Black feels like an attack sometimes in a predominantly white community, and people take it personal. And so there's been pushback in terms of the language that's used. There's been pushback in terms of, I have a young student who always said, in her school, she was known as the race girl. And so, exploring with her what that means and how do you combat that, and that explaining to her, you don't owe your community anything more of yourself than you're willing to give. And you don't, for your teachers, it's not, if you're not feeling it in terms of self-care, you don't have to step in for that. So a lot of it has been talking with the young people in large spaces or in private when they've come, or things that I've noticed, to just step in and let them know, like, you don't have to be the face of your race, right? That's not what it's there for. But true advocacy and activism is, it's on your heart, you're moving it, and how do we move in those community and spaces? So a lot of pushback with people being afraid to tackle this issue, not wanting to hear a dark-skinned Black woman speak and it be acceptable, and students of color and Black students, and how they're allowed to dress, how they're allowed to express their culture, how they're allowed to use their own euphemisms. And so those things, though, that kind of pushback, I am really good at, like I said, nodding my head and doing those nonverbal things in those spaces so that they have a safe space in me, and making myself a mobile safe space.
And Jamila, you've been trying to make all this, create the space for this to happen at scale, and trying to work with schools. So just jump in here with your wisdom. What do we need to know as we really sort of take on this approach? What are the barriers? What are the opportunities? Just be frank with us.
Yeah, I'll start with the opportunities, right? There's an opportunity every day to clear the slate and to do the work, right? And part of that work, means that we're showing up and unpacking our own identities so that we can be confident in spaces. And that, shine actually rubs off on student for them to be confident in spaces. So I do a lot of coaching. We do a lot of modeling, which you can hear from Asia's work, so that those things get translated in those spaces. And then we offer a lot of professional development opportunities, right? And so they may not necessarily be formal. They tend to be really informal opportunities for people to really think about what is my inner life, what sort of things is that shedding on my professional work, right? Am I in the right space? Am I doing the right things? And do I have a cohort of folks that are around me that I can, bounce ideas off of when I'm struggling? And we've always had that within our Sifer programs. We have a community of educators that we can say, hey, I have this challenge that's, coming up, or that I keep bumping my head against. How do we move forward from this? And so doing that, I think, is super important. And then, as Asia alluded to, some of the hard, heavy lifting is that you can be that lone ranger in a space and doing this, and that gets tiresome at times. And so, like any other person that practices good self-care, I pass the mantle on to other folks, white allies, and other folks, so that they can continue doing the work until I feel rested, and then I move into the next thing. So those are the major parts for me. Oh, Karen, you're still muted.
There we are. I almost got through a whole session without being on mute. What does it take to bring these into the different spaces you're committed to? One of the things that's unique about 4-H is it isn't a place, it isn't in a box. You take the programming, you bring the staff where they're needed. So what do you have to prepare your staff for if they're going to be working in schools versus clubs versus faith organizations versus rec departments? What does that mean? How do you get them prepared to anticipate what they may need to know and encounter as they move this into different places?
That is a great question. And I tell you, this is one that I marinate on all the time. I think that we do and we don't prepare folks, right? So we prepare them to be nimble, we prepare them to be flexible, so that when they enter into that space and there's something that's either uncomfortable for them, again, that they have a place where they can land and unpack those things and then go back and do it again. But as they're preparing for those spaces, we make sure that they know the lay of the land, right? So that they're reading as much as they can about the evidence-based research about how they should conduct themselves and how the youth development program should be done. We lean on, creating opportunities for youth voice and what that does to cultivate those relationships, but also to create a sense of belonging and a sense of trust. We really lean heavily on the PYD framework. And I think that that's at the heart of the work. So anything else in terms of subject matter material is secondary, but those relationships are really at the core of the work. And so we spend a lot of time on how we develop those relationships, irrespective of culture, and then also with specificity around what culture they're going to be working in. And that's the culture of school, that can be the culture of a particular community, that could be ethnic culture, all those things combined. So we do a lot of hand-holding.
That's terrific to understand. And I know that's a lot of work. I ponder it a lot myself. You mentioned the PYD framework, and Joanna mentioned as she was talking to us, her affinity for the positive youth development approach. What in particular have you seen valuable about bringing this incredibly updated science of adolescence and science of learning and development into what has been a long-standing approach around approaching young people as assets? Give us a minute about how you've been updating that model with the science.
Yeah. So what's really incredible is that, the PYD that I learned as a young person, as 13 in Girls Incorporated and Women's Sports Foundation programs, still looks a lot like the PYD that we deliver today, right? So we use a community-based approach to our work. We use a youth community action model where we work with young people to provide resources, and then invariably they take over and they provide the person power in order to deliver those resources. And then we just serve as guides. the thing that we're doing that's different is that our model didn't really include opportunities for equity, right? So we have to be really clear that that wasn't included in our model. And so we're unlearning a lot of things that we used to do in order to create opportunities for equity. And that means that means that our programs get to grow and that all of our young people, so our rural young people, our suburban, our urban young people, all get to grow in a very different way. And we find that young people are prepared for that. Our educators, maybe not so much, but the ones who are, we're using those educators in order to propel us forward. And so we're recrafting the model and unlearning a lot of different things and moving into a new sphere where that, we're looking at thriving alongside equity, alongside, right, a whole host of things that we're really important and committed to. So all those 6 C's, right, so that we're able to build in community.
Terrific. And before we sort of make one more transition, I'm going to see if Joanna is still with us and has any last words she wants to toss in, having had this terrific discussion about how all this science applies. Joanna.
Yeah, it's really heartening just to hear all of this in action. And there's so much like nice synergy between, what we know from the science and some of it, it's just like some of it is sort of, it's not, complicated or rocket science. It's about affirming youth identities and really, digging into doing that actively, understanding what that means in practice. And so to hear from Jamila and from Asia about what this looks like in practice, like these are like beautiful models of, how the recommendations that we draw from the science can look like in everyday work with and for youth.
Wonderful. And Dave, we're going to get you on screen. And Dave Martineau is with our Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality. And, one of the things that we're really talking about is how do we come back to this fundamental idea of program quality and make sure that we really are designing programs that are equitable and that are anti-racist. And we can't just assume that our traditional definitions of what quality looks like are really adequate for the times, and they probably never were. But now we're just being asked squarely to look at this and look at our ideas of quality through an anti-racism, through a social justice, and through a youth development lens. So the readiness projects, one of our earlier projects was to really sort of support putting together a book which will be coming out this fall, called It Takes an Ecosystem, Understanding the People, Places, and Possibilities of Learning and Development Across Settings. And it's an edited volume. And Dave, you and Alicia, one of our other colleagues, have a chapter in this book looking at this alignment and what it means for program quality. So give us a few minutes of what it takes and why it's important for us to all step back and not just understand the science, but see how it really gets baked into the things that we're doing to improve our programs.
Sure. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, it was a really exciting process. Alicia and I both were involved in the initial development of the Youth Program Quality Assessment tool some 22 years ago. And because we believe in continuous quality improvement, it probably never was fully adequate. It probably still isn't fully adequate, and we'll just keep working on making it respond to the moment. But we've always had a question in relation to the skills and the strategies that we would train staff to use with young people at the point of service, and to train leaders in organizations or networks in order to support their staff in using these skills or strategies or practices with young people, just in around their relevance and how universal they sort of are. So they come from a positive youth development approach, which looks at the science of learning and development and things that are good for all youth. But there's a question about if you really want to reach all youth or do things that are good for all youth, how do you think about each youth in front of you and where they're coming from, what their context is, and who they are? So there's a responsiveness that needs to be there and needs to somehow be baked into what it is we're looking at when we're looking at youth program quality assessment. So we decided to take a look at programs that are working more explicitly in a racial equity or social justice framework and the literature. So we did a review of the literature to find out, are there common features in those programs common practices that they might use that aren't captured in our current definition or construct of quality. And we identified 6 things that were kind of common features of what we called social justice programs for young people. These could be youth organizing spaces, civil rights organizations, healing spaces that are attending to the trauma that comes from living in an oppressive culture or society. Those programs do to be affirming healing-centered practices, which does involve in some ways helping them create meaning of their experiences, and to locate some of where that comes from outside of themselves as an individual person, but in the context of a society. So sometimes that's talked about as building a critical consciousness, being able to locate yourself in the broader context of society, which then translates to one of the things that Joanna just highlighted about affirming youth identities, that it helps promote a positive and healthy racial or cultural identity for the young people. They also help young people develop or create political commitments that are rooted in that critical consciousness. They create spaces for young people to take action, to disrupt injustice in their schools, in their neighborhoods, in their communities. They make troublemakers of the best kind, to actually take action and do something about what they see. And they also challenge discourses about the deficiency of young people and their communities. A lot of times folks enter into working with young people to sort of save them from their context, and in so doing, really create an understanding, a negative understanding in the minds of young people, about their community, about their family, which goes opposite what Jamila and Asia were just saying about looking at children, youth, and families as resources. So we need to help young people understand their families, their communities as resources to them, and that there are strengths embedded in those spaces.
Thank you, David, for giving us that brief overview, and we're all going to be looking forward to sort of digging into this chapter when it comes out, and even more importantly, staying tuned for the continuous efforts that you all are going to use to take our program quality improvement work and make it even more relevant and more focused in this space. We've been talking at you for a while, and I know that people are chatting, but I think we're probably ready to just sort of burst into group discussion. So I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to tell us how we get started to move into small groups. And thank all of you for this wonderful conversation.